So we are at noon. We do still have people filing into the room, but we can get this show on the road because we have lots to cover and just 1 hour to do it. Welcome everybody who's coming into the room and everybody who's already here. I am Kurt Gutjahr. I'm the Managing Director for the Center of the American West, and this is the third in our Lunch with Limerick series. We're quite excited to have Conevery Valencius, and she will be talking on getting sick and getting well, how Americans have understood disease and health. It's going to be a fascinating conversation. We have 2 more or 3 more events coming up in this series. Tomorrow, a very fascinating, interesting, compelling interview with Oregon Secretary of State former Secretary of State Phil Kiesling and CU Denver historian Cameron Blevins talking about the post office central role in American life, an advocate for 21st century voting by mail and a historian of the 19th century U.S. Post. Get acquainted. We've allotted an hour and a half for that event because we think there will be plenty to talk about, especially given our recent, I don't know what you would call that on Tuesday evening. And then October 6th and October 13th, we have 2 events on immigration, Party of Practicality. This coming Tuesday on the 6th, Congressman Joe Neguse will join us, as well as Tomas Jimenez and Mary Mendoza, both historians who focus on immigration and borderlands. So please register for that, participate in that. We've also allotted a longer period of time for that, over an hour and a half, just so that we are able to cover it fully. To register for those events, please go to our website, www.centerwest.org. All of you who are in the room, I think, probably have been there. And without further ado, I will turn this over to Patty Limerick.
Alrighty, thank you so much, Kurt, and thank you everyone for joining us. It's totally fun. It's very tempting to keep reading you individually, but that would that's not really what I guess we came here for. So I am, everyone's heard this from me, I am so gifted as a talent scout. It's really pretty dazzling. I have 1 or 2 other small talents, but that's really where I come into my own. And so I keep trying to remember where the convention was, but I ended up at exactly the right table at dinner, and there was Conevery, and heavens, what a lively person. I had been aware of that. I'd seen her speak at conference sessions and so on, but really, what, 2.5 hours or so at dinner with her, I just thought, okay, all the talent scouting signals are coming in here. So I would have found a way to do this, but I didn't, to make sure that I involved you in our programs. And yet this is so much of a match. Conevery's area is history of medicine, history of health, how human beings see themselves. We have some wonderful friends, Barbara Rosencrantz from Old Times, with mutual friends in that field. And she is the author of a book, which I'm going to brandish just a second. The Health of the Country, How American Settlers Understood Themselves and Their Land. So the second that we started to gear up on this idea of doing an interview series, I thought, I know who I need to have. Someone who can do our applied history 2-step at Center of the American West and make very, very thoughtful and informed remarks about the past, and then help us understand what from the past we can find relevance in now and where the past is simply just a whole other country, as they say. So, Conevery, hello. Thank you for being here.
What a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Really
and it's really neat to see in this very strange pandemic universe we find ourselves in, all the really creative ways that people are finding to connect, right?
It's very cool. It's very cool.
I like this.
This other option, which is what I followed for a while, someday I'll be at a conference and she'll be at the dinner table with me. That wasn't really working out in this area. So this is really, really good. So I think we should start in the past and then move pretty fast into the present. This is a substantial book, and there's, oh my Lord, what a festival of great quotations, as well as great comments from the author reflecting on those. But so let's do the impossible. Could you just take a few minutes to tell us about how people heading west in the early and middle 19th century understood their health? And I know that you're taking a very substantial book, and I've given you 3 or 4 minutes, so go.
Most of us today feel like we have a certain quality of health, and that gets messed with most of the time when little things get into our body and infect us. If something else enters us, that will make us sick. People of the 19th century, and by people I really mean people, white people, African Americans, some few of the native peoples who I've read about, had whose material I've read, had a very different idea. That health was something that was in you and that was a balance within you all the time. And the externalities of the world could throw that balance off. There were forces in the world, whether that was emanations from minerals, certain winds that would come by, that would affect the force. Those were forces in the rest of the world that would affect the forces within your body. And some people may be familiar with the really old idea of humoral theory, different humors or fluids or forces within the body. Those needed to be in balance for people to be healthy. So keeping healthy wasn't just keeping away from an infection. It was about being in a balance with the rest of the world. And that might mean holding your temper, avoiding strong drink, certainly avoiding fresh fruits. They could do you terrible harm. It might also mean getting near fresh turpentine, fresh pine woods, because the smell of turpentine would be very healing. Going up to high hills rather than swampy lowlands. So health was a constant maintenance project for each individual and for communities. And it was a conversation between people's physical forms and the land around them.
That sounds even more nerve-wracking, or maybe more calming. I'm trying to think about that. By the way, I just need to throw in for people that you do know that I and 3 friends went as the 4 humors of mankind to a Halloween party. And it's possible that for Halloween, which is coming up, we could have a special Zoom program where I reminisce about great Halloween costumes that I was a part of, just to throw that out to tease the audience on that. But could we go back?
Just in case anyone out there might think that historians would be really fun to invite to parties, we could show up as, black bile, right? Because that's the kind of party people we are. Yes.
Right. Sanguinity is the better part. But anyway, so could we go back to that puzzlement that I got to? Was that more, well, I'm not sure the word anxiety, I'm using words that don't fit in the time period, but to have that sense, got to be on this all the time, thinking about this, seeing this out, this external force, trying to balance that, trying to keep the humors balanced, that seems like it would be more draining or preoccupying or worrisome. Or not, because it's stuff that you could think about and manage. Help me.
So one of the really interesting things about our last 6 months, right, in this country, is that a lot of us are experiencing the kinds of constant preoccupation with managing the balances of our health that many people of the 19th century held, and that everybody with chronic disease and chronic illness today experiences, right? So I have multiple times had the experience of saying to friends of mine, oh, I can't believe it, I've got to do this and this. And then I look up and realize, right, and you have MS,
yeah.
Right? I'm not telling you anything you don't already know way better than I'm ever going to learn it, right? So what's interesting, I think, is the way in which many of us who are in our modern world, we have the real honor and the arrogance of being able to walk along not aware of the active management of our health at every moment. We're having to join the country where we do, where a lot of us live already and where everybody lived in the past.
That's really, really interesting. So I want to get very quickly to how nerve-wracking our times are, but I'm just going to take us one more visit. Well, we can go back to the past whenever we want to, because, well, how could they stop us, really? We're historians. So what did the people of the past know that we forgot? And you kind of said that by the things that we took for granted, but just to what degree were the people of this past really smarter and, or at least better instructed by life than we are today?
I think I never want to say that people of the past were better than we were, because then that might get us in a position of us saying, like, yeah, because we're really much more smarty pants than they are about other things. But I think what I would say is that they were much more frank about the idea that we all exist as physical beings all the time.
Right.
And people in the United States were really clear on how people also exist as moral or spiritual beings, right? One's rightness with God was part of what made you healthy or not in the 19th century. And, you know, regardless of our individual faith at the moment, I think a lot of us are having to be confronted with the idea that whether you're tremendously worried about the state of the world, the rising seas, or the state of democracy, that impacts all of our health, which we all already knew. But again, a lot of us could pretend like we didn't know. So I think that people in the 19th century understood that health was something that was multidimensional and all around them and required active management of all those dimensions. And I think when we all think about it, we know that too, but we kind of, many of us who live in health without chronic disease like to pretend like that's not the case.
Okay, so now I would like to celebrate large visible creatures that try to weaken us. So I wasn't until I was with you and this notion that we think small organisms come and take us over. I'm thinking that leeches, for instance, are good because you can see them and you know when they're a problem. And the fact that these small organisms that we know are the causes of our misfortune, that we can't see the little suckers, makes it just beyond terrifying and adds psychological dimensions of wobbliness and constant worry, because if they would just show up and register their malevolence, that would be great.
Then we'd have to admit all of the bazillion creatures, and I believe that's a technical term, that inhabit our bodies and enrich our guts all the time that help us out, right? I think basically we don't like admitting how ruled we are by infinitesimally small creatures. And one of the things I talk a lot about with my undergraduate students when we talk about the history of medicine, because a lot of them are people who want to go into nursing, they want to be physicians, they want to be health lawyers, they're engaged in this world of modern medicine. And I try to say to them, let's talk about the amazing intellectual leap it takes to think that very, very small creatures, little animals in an early modern sense, that we cannot see, we cannot directly taste, we can't directly feel, we can't hear them. They can enter our bodies in this huge variety of ways that are very particular to the organism, that aren't all the same, and that those can determine huge aspects of how we are well or how we are sick. I mean, that's as crazy as thinking that, we're on an earth that is constantly revolving at a huge rate of speed, right? Or that we are revolving around the sun when obviously it moves in the sky above me, right? It's really an astounding leap. And I think that one of our temptations as modern people where, we get in cars that run well and have airplanes that fly through the sky and medicines that keep us well, is to assume that, well, of course we have this all figured out just because it's obviously common sense. And I think it's really useful for us to see sometimes how incredibly hard we had to work to create our common sense of today.
It is. I mean, you think a really dreadful science fiction writer would have cooked up just as a scary novel, and it's what we live. I'm just going to ask you, because I do spend time with geologists, and I do ask them, push them pretty hard. How do you help normal people, which is to say not geologists, how do you help them think in really unimaginably long units of time? What do you look at a particular strata and point that out? How do you do that? Well, same question to you, but how do you get people to think with some degree of calmness, but also a degree of appropriate agitation about these little, or well, many of them are delightful little creatures. I got that. They're helping us right now. We're benefiting from that. But the creepy ones, how do you get people, do you go by analogies? How do you make that happen?
How do we get to a point where we believe in germ theory? Is that what you're asking?
Without freaking out.
Oh, without freaking out.
Or without that level of freaking out.
Right. One of the things we study in my history of medicine class is the astounding scientific and intellectual and social power of the decades right at the end of the 1800s, when clever scientists in a bunch of different labs, mostly in Europe, a couple in Asia, and a couple in the United States, were beginning to name and identify the bacteria that caused a number of important human diseases. And they couldn't, keep in mind that at that point, they couldn't see viruses because they're too small to be seen with light microscopes, but they could see the stuff that was big enough to be seen with a light microscope, a desktop model, but too small, far too small to be seen with an unaided eye. And that was before there was an effective way to actually treat most of those diseases. Mm-hmm. But naming them was front page news. And when Robert Koch identified the bacteria that causes tuberculosis, that made front page news around this country and many others. So there's something extraordinarily exciting and liberating about being able to name and see the causes of your ill health, even if at that moment you can't fix it.
Yeah.
And the way that people fixed tuberculosis or treated tuberculosis, even after that bacteria was named and identified, the way they treated it was the same as they'd been treating it before. You got people out in the sunshine and out in the fresh air, trying to breathe in the healthful airs of the West, like where many of y'all are right now. So that the treatments didn't shift immediately, but the power of naming was still enormously exciting.
Really interesting. And I shall be contemplating for several days on what that kind of knowledge that doesn't come with any action plan, why that would be anything but make it worse or something. I'm really taken with this. And
well, in a few cases, once you knew what the bug was, you could see where it lived and try to employ hygiene regimes that would change it, right? So there were times when identification would let you prevent something. But what's really interesting in the history of medicine is how far ahead the naming and identification was of most forms of treatment.
really interesting. Yeah.
So that gives me hope, right? That we take power in our ability to structure our understanding,
right.
Even if sometimes we have to admit that we're not all that powerful in fixing things.
No, I love that. That's why I keep thinking about this. I'm wondering if, assuming like a lot of what we were speaking of now, or what you're speaking of, is about helping us understand why tests have become so much a matter of intense attention and contestation and trust and distrust and so on. So if you had the nation's attention for a little spell, however long, well, the nation doesn't really pay attention in a concentrated way to anything anymore, but let's say that they were going to do that, and you had just a minute or two to say to them, when you confront the question of the state of testing for COVID-19, here are two things from history that you should probably have in your mind as you try to evaluate how you feel about tests.
Oh, interesting.
And I'm asking you, I'm not answering that one. So,
so one is that knowing about large groups has been really useful, even when our knowledge about an individual isn't all that good, right? So some of the most important interventions in the history of medicine have come about because of the development of medical statistics, which were, surveying and reporting on very, very large groups of people and looking at how large groups' health has changed, or whether big populations of people, responded to a certain treatment or not. That has let us in the big sense, like, medical practitioners and the whole medical establishment, figure out a lot of interventions to treat us when we are injured or ill, or to keep us healthy, when we're not. And often those large scale statistics leave out or obscure or don't say a lot about an individual person.
mm-hmm.
So we all like to think of ourselves, or maybe I like to think of myself as an individual in myself. I matter, just me. But some of the most important information I contribute to my own well-being is probably the little, symbolic tick marks that I make, right, of statistics. I've had a couple of COVID tests in the state of Massachusetts, right? Every one of those goes into the denominator of Massachusetts testing rate. That's really important information, even though we know that not every individual's COVID test is necessarily precisely accurate.
It never would have occurred to me that statisticians and John Donne were birds of a feather. I mean, no man is an island. Every man's death diminishes me. I have lived for many years and I never saw statisticians. I never thought they had anything to do with poets. This is quite striking, because that's basically the lesson, is that no man is an island. And what?
Yes, but I also think that people who work with very large, like the geologists that I hang around with too, and that I've learned so much from, and that you were talking about, people who work with enormous stretches of deep time, right. Just like statisticians who manipulate huge data sets, right? I sometimes think that people who work imagining the very, very large, right. Are able to see and often articulate the beauty of scale in a way that I, in my ordinary life, don't usually have access to.
I agree. I don't think I have a mind capable of that, but I like hanging out with people who do have minds capable of that. So let's talk about air and what good air has meant in the past and how humans have interpreted that and how we are doing with that. And good heavens, has it become a variable in our world here. And the Pacific coast is obviously much more continuously with that, but you don't know when the sky's going to go orange on you.
That's right.
You assume that probably has something to do with what would happen if you went for a walk. And so I'll talk about attitudes towards air.
So in the 19th century medical world, one of the most important elements of whether you were well or sick were the miasmas that would surround you. And a miasma was, we would kind of think of it like a stinky fog, but usually it was not really seen to be visible. I mean, if there was a fog arising over a swamp, then people would call that a miasma. But miasmas were the elements of a place that arose from a place, especially from what we would kind of think of as nasty places, like swamps, anywhere where there was rotting, putrid matter, things that would give off a real fleshy, organic smell would often produce a miasma. But so could volcanoes, and earthquakes would produce miasmas from the interior of the earth. So it wasn't only organic. The earth itself produced these emanations. And you can think about the way in which the human body produces smells and odors and gases and other emanations. Miasmas you would breathe them in and they would make you sick. So if you were in an unhealthy place, as people of the 19th century wrote about it and thought about it, then the miasmas of that place would weaken you and your body would have to be fortified extremely, whether with strong medicine, sometimes with strong drink, certainly with a balanced lifestyle, plenty of prayer and fresh air, getting along with your spouse, not beating your wife overly much. I mean, those were all ways that you would strengthen your body to deal with unhealthy miasmas. And the good air, in contrast, was what would help you gain your strength back. So going to, on a clear day, walking up a high hillside and breathing in fresh air, I mean, obviously in the 19th century, that would strengthen you. And I would say, obviously in the 21st, it does too, but obvious for very different reasons, right? One of the really interesting tragedies of our present moment is how aware we all have come to be in very different ways and overlapping ways of air. So this is a moment where almost everyone living in the great American West is acutely aware at every moment of what the sky is like. Right? I can't tell you how many friends and colleagues have sent me pictures out their windows of eerie orange and red sky, right? Just to communicate like this is what I'm living in. Imagine this. So the fires that we would explain in a scientific way, that we know that fine particulates are really crummy for human lungs and put us at great risk for other kinds of limitation of our breathing, that those also are frightening to us because it makes the world look so differently than it should be. We worry about everything that's in that ash that might be coming down upon us or upon our crops or our livestock. And it gives us a sense that we can't know what's in the air. But of course, we've never known what's in the air. One of the things that's really fascinating to me is to look with my college students today, who are by and large people of about 18 to 22, at images taken by the Environmental Protection Agency right as it's at its idealistic beginnings, photographs of pollution throughout the United States. Part of what the project was called Documerica. And the EPA hired a bunch of really good photographers to go all around the United States taking pictures. And you can see it on the EPA website today, Documerica. And it is incredibly interesting to see the deep brown lines of smog over every American city, right? And the ways in which our air was visibly smoggy. And we've managed to reduce that, largely through the Clean Air Act and all of the legislation that followed. So a lot of us complain a lot of the time about burdensome environmental regulation. And in some sense, it's a real shock to look at the world before, like the 1970 Clean Air Act or a lot of its sibling legislation that has transformed the world. I mean, I had my blood tested for lead levels before I was going to nurse some little children, and my lead levels were fine. And that's probably because of the de-leading of gasoline. I mean, certainly because of the de-leading of gasoline and all of the strictures of the Clean Air Act. And most likely, my bones have a lot less lead in them than my mother's do, right? Because of when she grew up and when I grew up. Right? So people in the deep past saw errors as sickening them or strengthening them. And many of us, have kind of walked around without an understanding of the errors around us.
Now we have such a contrast in how we feel about being outside and what that will do to the presence of aerosols and droplets, and being in a confined indoor space and what that will do. The miasma has kind of gone indoors in some.
That's exactly right. And one of the things that 19th century people would do, and this is like way up through the 1880s and 90s, and especially in the West, which was high places in the West were understood by many to be very healthful and health-giving. A lot of folks would, especially when you had tuberculosis, put children outside, right? So all these images of these highly bundled up, very small kids grinning beneath their mufflers, right, in outdoor school. And one of the, I think, really tragic missed opportunities of our present pandemic moment is that we haven't, maybe certain communities have, but we haven't sort of as a nation said, well, maybe we need to really move schooling outside, right? We have kept to this model that schooling must be indoors, and because that's not safe in so many parts of the country, kids are having to make do, in the ways that my house is now full of studious high schoolers who would, I'm sure, like to be elsewhere. So that's a kind of, we could have been 19th century about this, right? We could have thought, you know what, maybe we're going to kind of regard the outdoors with more robustness.
So it's really how we appraise ourselves and our resilience and robustness as to why we're not having class, because we have wonderful outerwear for warmth.
Well, it's also really expensive outerwear, right? And I mean, we both live in places with very, very bitterly cold winters. And, it's a consistent problem in the public schools around me that a lot of kids will come to school without a proper coat, without things on their hands. These are non-trivial problems, right? Of equipping young children to be outside a lot of the time. But what is interesting to me and sad to me, is how that's not even the problem we're attacking.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So I just had one, to go back to the 19th century. It just seems like the notion, I had not got the part that miasmas are things you can't see necessarily, and that the earth is just doing that to us all the time. So that would enrage me with the earth. I think if I thought the earth was exhaling in ways that were threatening to me, did that give a sense of people living on a precarious planet and not trusting the ground beneath their feet for its?
That's an interesting point. I have not read in any 19th century person's writings a sense that wasn't somehow expected. I mean, of course the earth responded in that way. I mean, in the same way that, of course, we speak of veins of precious metals running through the earth. Well, I mean, up through the 19th century, that wasn't a metaphor, right? I mean, the earth was considered to have a sort of life, not precisely the same life that humans would, or cows or pigs would, or even mosquitoes, but it had a life. And, and through it ran veins in the same, much the same way that blood runs through our veins.
Yeah.
So it was a much larger sense of the earth's vitality, in the sense of being vital.
That is really interesting. I never thought about the word vein. It never paused for a moment on that. So thank you for that. And I want to ask about fevers, and this wonderful young woman, Carrie Alexander, who doesn't seem to be on here with us, but I'll tell her that she needs to watch this because I'm referring to her. She's getting her PhD at UC Davis, and she is the one who really brought to my attention that what I always heard is celebratory. When people in the 19th century say, oh, we have gold fever, or we have land fever, that was a, boy, are we a peppy group and we're just moving around. But it was Carrie who made me come to attention and think, well, that's not a very positive figure of speech. And she feels that, in fact, 19th century people, when they said gold fever has possessed them, land fever has possessed them, that was not, oh, hooray, what a lively group we are, but there's a kind of there's a sickness, it's a fever. So what do you make of that term?
Yes, and that's a wonderful point. In the 19th century, fevers were often what killed you if it wasn't childbirth.
Yeah, right.
Fevers were dangerous. Fevers possessed you. They took you out of yourself. And this is a moment where, you were asking a little bit earlier about how do we communicate the realities of a past time in our present age. One of the things that's really interesting as a middle-aged college professor that I've started asking my students is, have you ever lain in bed delirious with a high fever?
Yeah.
And people who are, 20 years old plus or minus, many of them haven't, because they've grown up in a medical regime where when children have a fever, many pediatricians would recommend giving giving painkillers to bring the fever down. And what's interesting is actually, side note, is that advice is starting to shift, and we're starting to recognize, well, actually fevers are part of what chases the disease, quells the disease, and don't treat it unless the child's really miserable. But for, a generation and a half, we've been treating fevers. So I have a really clear memory of multiple occasions in my childhood of, watching the wallpaper kind of move in and out in this really psychedelic way, right? Because I, had a fever of 102 or 3 or whatever it was. And most people of the 19th century, whatever their race, whatever their social class, whatever their occupation, fairly regularly had high fevers, because the 19th century was full of diseases and infections that caused those. So when you were talking about a fever in the 1840s with gold rushes, or later and earlier, you weren't making a sort of flowery, poetic, distant metaphor. You were talking about something that you might have experienced last week, or that you might have sat by the bedside of someone you loved for a long time, the previous night. And those were dangerous. They could kill you, but they also could inspire you. And remember that out of fevers could come spiritual visions. Out of fevers, could come poetry.
Poetry, well, there's so just a quick test here on the question. In many ways, what you were giving us today is a kind of nostalgia reduction treatment program, because to be living, I guess, especially in the Missouri and Mississippi Valley, in a place where fevers just came through, and you've already said that in some ways we're living in a little bit 19th century manner of not taking well-being for granted. So, but is there a degree of not suck it up, but don't lose perspective that whatever it is that we think we are facing in the way of a terrible, 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 terrible situation, maybe 2 of those terribles should be dropped if we're thinking in the longer term?
I don't know if I could ever look anybody, in the eye who's lost a relative to COVID and say, oh, it's not that bad. No. But I do think that that the historical record gives us a few more cultural resources than we might know we had for addressing such a challenge. Uh-huh. People have been enormously creative about dealing with dangerous diseases in the past. Mm-hmm. In many situations, people were much more understanding and willing to recognize that, if you had malaria, well, if it was your fever day, because malaria has this course of episodic recurrence, well, if it was your fever day, then clearly you couldn't be the one to do as hard labor. That was a recognition far less granted to African-American people laboring in slavery. That was much more something claimed by free people, but it was still relatively widespread. That there was a sense that people could do that people's intentions could only take you so far. And in the 19th century was, again, very hard to understand people's individual personal beliefs, but in a sort of larger cultural level, most everybody expressed their experiences in terms of Christian theology. So, God was with you through these experiences, and you could never, you wouldn't necessarily fully understand the will of providence. So a bit of having to accept what happened and having to get through it. And also having to understand when other people were sick, that they simply had to endure that also.
Yeah.
One of the really interesting things about this pandemic is the frankness of our discussion. So there have been lots of other epidemics that Americans have gone through in the last generation or two, in which whether you tested positive or negative would not be something you would commonly discuss with your boss, right? And so what's very interesting is for me is to hear a lot of people say, like, we've never been through something like this. And I think, you know, I was a teenager when HIV/AIDS began to affect people in my environment. And, you know, any gay man my age or older has lived through an entire revolution in physical understanding and intimate relations. So this idea that we have to rework our ways that we are intimate with people and show our affection to them. Well, yeah, and people, a lot of communities have had to do that and have come up with good ways to do that.
That's really good. The cultural resources that we don't recognize are in our storage systems. If we were to get those out and use some, that's really
right. I mean, you know, I think if right now, if a student says, I'm COVID positive, then as a professor, I say, oh, okay, well then, here's the set of accommodations I make, and here's how you're going to stay away from the class, and let me know if you're sick, and I'll give you an extension on this, and whatever. You know, what would our teaching be like if somebody said, you know, I'm sick, and we automatically did that? I mean, because right now there's often a pressure to sort of push people to document, or are you really sick? Can't you cope with it? Can't you get over it? And, you know, I think that our teaching in our work worlds would be a lot more humane, and I suspect a lot more productive if we were as frank about other kinds of ailments as we are currently about COVID.
Yeah. So I want to get on to race and region, and I also want to make sure that the folks participating with us know what I know, which is that you know a fair amount about COVID-19.
I've had a very 19th century experience. Yes. Yeah, I got sick with this right when my school dispersed last March, and haven't been very well, I mean, till about the last month. And that has, it was surprising to me as a historian of the 19th century, how affronted I was, right? I keep feeling a sort of indignation of, well, why don't I feel myself yet? Why don't I feel stronger? How come my joints still ache? How come I'm still achy and don't want to get out of bed? Well, you know, the 19th century people whose letters I read would never have been surprised by such a thing, because of course, you know, diseases hang on, they get a hold of you, and you have to strengthen your constitution, but that takes a long time. So, you know, it's been a sort of an extremely humbling experience for me, not only individually, but historically, to think, oh, I thought I kind of knew a little bit about this stuff. And turns out I only understood it when people in the past were going through it. Now that I'm going through a very long, slow, weird recovery, I find that I'm quite indignant at the experience.
That, I will say, that was that gave me chills when you said that, which made me think perhaps I'm falling ill. No, just kidding. But it was intense, because it was such an amazing moment of the historian encountering her studies in such an intense and engaged way. That was, I'm not going to say psychedelic, but in terms of the wallpaper moving in and out while you're at your fever, it just was that was a very remarkable.
Oh, thank you. Well, and I think that one, I think many of us looking around at our current intellectual, social, epidemiological, political life right now need to find the silver linings, right? And I think one of the small gifts of this really trying and terrible time is, I think, that a lot of people are having to be reflective about our well-being in a way that we have not had to be. And certainly I have found that interesting, right? In all of the ambivalences of that word, interesting, right? I'd really prefer not to learn any of that. Thank you very much. Right? But,
yeah.
But lo and behold, we all learn.
We're going back to, actually, I guess we're a little bit in transition to the 19th century for a moment or two more on the race and region stuff, but I want to ask about contagion as a social relationship, because it seems like the people of the 19th century did not have to see each other as vectors, not their term, but agents of infection. Because I think, for instance, on the Overland Trail, I never quite got it. I mean, I understand that the disease, the germ theory wasn't there, but the way people on the trail can be so kind in tending to a person with cholera, where you would think they would just think, getting the hell out of here. Just water transmitted, I gather. But it just seems like people were very at ease with the, now I am in the company of a terribly ill person, but I'm not the least bit frightened, partly because I don't, largely, I guess, because, no, so I want to hear, if you know, where'd you catch this? Have you asked yourself that? Does it matter? And what does that question, which I'm bugging you with, but what does that say about the bigger picture of social relations that we're encountering now around aging?
So one of the interesting things about the 19th century is, yes, people were by and large compassionate to those who were sick with many kinds of fevers, especially cholera, especially because for most of the 19th century, cholera, which we now know as a waterborne bacteria that makes you incredibly sick and you usually die essentially of systemic shock after massive dehydration. Salt pumps of your cells shut down because you get so massively dehydrated from all the gross GI stuff that you're going through. That disease was understood to be one manifestation, a particularly bad manifestation of a set of disorders. Right? So getting cholera was kind of on a continuum of being unwell. We now would name cholera as a far more specific disease that is separate from other things that would make you throw up or have terrible diarrhea or might kill you. There are other diseases that if you had them on an overland trail, people would probably abandon you immediately and possibly burn your wagon, right? Smallpox. Because smallpox was understood by many cultures across a lot of the world's history to be spread person to person. And that was, that was clearly the case by the early modern period and up through the 19th century. So smallpox, you got away from, and you separated the people who had it. Other fevers were much more modulated by the environment that you were around, the waters and airs that you were moving through. So you didn't need to separate from a person.
So,
you'd asked about COVID and where we catch it. And I think there's, we haven't quite gotten there in most of the United States now, but in a couple of other countries, we've seen intense persecution of those who are seen to be intentionally or carelessly spreading. And I think that's something we have to be really watch out for. The demonization of patient zero, right, is something that can be very dangerous and that creates a lot of culpability to a person who, in most cases had no idea that they were an agent of disease. Right now, what is interesting to me is that cholera is that COVID is such a shared experience that most people are sort of regarding it as a common enemy with which, against which we have to guard ourselves before we go in a grocery store. I think if, once that's very different from diseases that we've identified as being from certain groups of people, whether it's, ignorant Catholic immigrants of the 19th century, or if it's homosexual men of the early 80s. And I don't know, I have no crystal ball, but I suspect that we're not at the end of that story about COVID, and that one of the things we may need to be both careful about and compassionate about is the identification of people or groups of people as particularly prone to spread.
I just had a memory of something I'd forgotten, but in the early AIDS thing, I went to a meeting of a college committee, and we were convened privately so that we could know that one of our members had AIDS, and how did we feel about continuing to meet on the committee. Well, I don't know what we're going to do in the committee, but it seemed like that was not going to be a concern. But I had forgotten all about that. And I'm sure that was some administrator trying to do the right thing of making sure that we knew what's going on. But the notion that we would then say, I'm resigning from the committee because I will be at risk from that poor soul's I'm glad I forgot about that, and now I'm sad I remembered that, because that was a very curious moment of someone, I think, trying to do the right thing, but just, I don't know, scrambling stuff. So I want to get to race and 19th century associations of what racial identity meant to the affliction, illness, and then some jumping forward to the present on that.
Yes, because I think that absolutely connects also with the meanings and the tragedies of breathing in air today. So in the 19th century, people weren't just people. You were people, a person of a particular stock. So if you were of a hardy European stock, that meant you had a certain fitness. You were appropriate for certain climates. And if you were understood to be of African stock, well, that meant, in the eyes of many white free people of the 19th century, that you were ordained by God to do labor in the hot sun. So the medical environmentalism that I was describing earlier was deeply enmeshed with fundamental racism within American science and medicine. So that there were whole textbooks about Southern diseases that would recommend completely different levels of treatment and different dosages of powerful drugs, depending on if the person who had the illness was Black or white. People's bodies were understood to be fundamentally different, mostly understood by the white folks writing these elite manuals, but their ideas were very influential. One of the tragedies of this current epidemic is how incredibly racially differentiated it is, right? That our current novel coronavirus epidemic is hitting Black and brown and Native communities so much harder than many white communities. And so I've talked to a number of people who will say to me, wow, I understand how important it is to wear a face mask, and I think it's just so terrible that everything's getting, this. I feel for the kids who aren't in school, but I don't know anybody who's had this.
Oh, yeah.
And I will talk to other people, like many of my students, who have lost multiple family members, right? Or many, many people in their circle of people they love and are neighbors around them. So the cruelty of the way in which this disease has hit different of us differently according to where we are socially and racially situated, I think is part of why we're having such a hard time coming to consensus about what to do about this disease.
You want me to ask you on what of that higher proportion of affliction might be material and biological, and how much of it is access to healthcare, and how much of it is having jobs that each time I say how much, I think something's not working in my question here. But
yes, I mean, the answer is yes, yeah. Right? And also the answer is, like, in 5 years, we'll probably know more. And yeah. I'm a historian, not an epidemiologist. But what we know about is that COVID-19 absolutely tracks the racial disparities that we have seen in everything from your risks of dying to cancer to your risks of dying in childbirth. Right? That an African-American woman living in my town right now in the Boston area has if she has a PhD, we know that, generally speaking, the more educated you are, the healthier you are up to a certain age. A woman who's got multiple graduate degrees and is fully employed as a gainfully productive member of society, if she's African American, she faces a greater risk as a Boston mother of dying during childbirth than a 14-year-old white kid who hasn't made it through high school yet. Right? So and of a woman of her same age who hasn't made it through high school. So that race seems to trump all kinds of other risk factors throughout many things that make us weaker or sicken us or kill us as Americans. And there's certainly not one answer for why that is. But there's sorry.
No. Well, okay. I guess, given our time, I think I do want to push us on to the use of the terms health and illness, healthy and sick, as analogies, metaphors, figures of speech. I actually don't, I'm never sure which term I'm supposed to be using for those things, but is that a place for cautionary tales for people who use those terms without
Well,
thinking through? I mean, what do you think about that when you see that?
well,
Is that
and getting at your prior question, I was marching in a protest march through downtown Boston a couple of months ago with a mask on, staying apart from other people. And a young Black man next to me was chanting, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." And that, looking over at him, it really hit me, because he was about the same age and size and shape as one of my sons. And he was chanting, "I can't breathe." And we are in the middle of an epidemic that has cut off breath.
Yeah.
Fatally from 210,000 Americans at least right now. And this is an epidemic that is happening at the same time that people are losing jobs, losing access to healthcare, losing, in some cases, their health insurance, and are being afflicted by a similar epidemic of brutal policing. And that this notion that George Floyd's death was as he was COVID positive. George Floyd's lungs were full of fluid as he was being held down on the pavement. And he is saying, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." And that is so tragically exactly an emblem of both our COVID epidemic and the crisis of racism that our country is in right now.
breathing be the great unit of common experience that, if anything, caused us to say, well, we're all in this together, or no man is an island, or it would be our enthusiasm for breathing? Shouldn't that?
In the Hebrew Bible, that great, that great spiritual text, it is breath, right? The breath of life that begins humanity, right? Adam is breathed into by Creator. Like we are clay until we are given breath. And, anybody who's been in Boy Scouts, Girls, or BSA or Girl Scouts, right, knows 3 minutes without air, right? 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food, right?
Oh.
It doesn't take much without air for human life to stop. And that is something that many of us can go through a whole day without thinking of. And the commonality of the experience of having one's breathing constricted by COVID is causing all of us, even if we don't have asthma and we don't have seasonal allergies and we're not afflicted by COVID, causing all of us, I think, to think again about what that means. And I think that's particularly true for many people in communities of color and indigenous communities who are saying, we are not given access to what we need to breathe, whether that's in terms of security and equal treatment, or whether it's because we are not allowed access to the safe environments where the air is healthy to breathe.
So let's go to this framework, because I did give us a couple of quotations to.
Yes.
And since I know one of the people, I don't know the other one, but I do know Tim Egan, and I sent you a quotation. I had several hundred of these where people casually use the analogy of health or sickness. And I was very gracious and cut my hundreds to 2. That was one of them. It's going to be great before, I think, probably. But Tim Egan, in a New York Times column in September 13th, said, "The West of 2020 is very sick." And Thomas Friedman, in a column in the New York Times today, says, yesterday, I guess, "You cannot sustain a healthy democracy under the conditions we are in now." So there's 2 pundits who are just using that as if it were so self-evident a form of, if Tim thinks it's sick, the West is, that's not, what could he mean by that? He knows what we'll all know. I guess he knows that we'll all know what that means. And same for Thomas Friedman to say that. So would you give them, I don't know what, a lesson of caution, or what I've sometimes said with the old myths of the Old West is that those myths of the Old West use you before you can use them. That was a clever thing I used to say. So I'm just wondering if there's some of that when people lightly and casually, well, they're not lightly or casually, I guess, but when people use, this is a healthy society, this is a sick society, or should somebody like you say to them, you might want to use that with a little bit more care? Or are they using it exactly as they ought to? What do you think about that?
I think that language has power. Mm-hmm. And as Spider-Man would tell us, any power has to be used wisely. But and with great responsibility. But when sickness and health, I think, speak to a sense of things being out of balance, mm-hmm. of things being out of whack. And I believe that that's a powerful critique. I read, maybe not hundreds, but many of those similar kinds of statements, and see that as having power precisely because all of us have had the experience of going through transitions in health. And most of us have had the experience of being ill in one way or another. Yeah. And we know the powerlessness and the out of balance of that experience. So I think it's a very powerful statement. I also think, and this is where, as a 19th century historian, I would say, that is also a statement that maybe gives us some hope. 19th century people understood that sometimes there was nothing you could do. But often, if you just worked at it, if you brought to bear enough management, if you gave it enough time, right, you could maybe work your system back into balance. I think one of the things I see very much around me in our world right now in our current pandemic is the completely understandable desire for there to be a quick fix, a magic bullet. Where's the shot? Where's the vaccine that will fix this and make it better? And unfortunately, it's unlikely to be a quick fix. Even when we get, hopefully, if we get a vaccine, which I very much hope we do, it will not be quick because it won't be totally complete. Right? There would be one little thing you could do that would take away a disease. You have to manage it, and you have to manage it through your social relations. You have to manage it through changed practices of life, as people in the 1800s would say. And that gives me some comfort of thinking that, we have some hope of being able to get to do that work and to engage in that arduous process, but come out to the other side in a state of better balance, and in a situation in which our everyday will no longer be so grievously ruled by this epidemic disease.
Well, that is a perfectly timed and very excellent and well-aimed closing remark. You could have another 34 seconds for a closing remark, but that seemed very good. So do you want 42 seconds?
I think I was reflecting this morning on the fact that you and I would be speaking from places so far distant that people couldn't have traveled them in under weeks, and that weeks at a good slot, a good trot in the 19th century, and that many people would be dialing in, listening potentially from parts in between, and that was a beautiful, that kind of bridging spoke to me both of the separateness of our experience. You have a very different air quality right now in Boulder than I do outside of Boston, but also the way in which maybe we could start to see some shared experience across these different environments of health and of wellness.
Cool, wonderful. She teaches at Boston College, and I think I might have not shared that information with you, but we have ended up in Boston, and that's really good to have that tie. And it is amazing that we could have been doing this kind of let's chat, but it took this trouble to get us into a situation of doing that. I do want to say that she will be back with us at some point because we didn't really time did not permit us to talk about the history of smallpox and the vaccine there and the social context of that, tuberculosis, the West, and so on. Didn't get to do that. Fracking, she's working on fracking now, so she'll be back.
And can I just say hello to the U.S. history students who are watching? I was just told that there's a class online, and it's great to have y'all here.
That's excellent. Very, very excellent. Good to hear that. And I do want to make sure that everybody knows that tomorrow at noon, my former student, Phil Kiesling, former Secretary of State in Oregon, who made Oregon the first state with, not he single-handedly, but as what a forceful person. Oregon is the first place to have mail-in ballots entirely. And so Phil Kiesling will be with us, and a kind of protege, wonderful young man, Cameron Blevins, who wrote a very wonderful new book on the post office and westward expansion. The two of them will be chatting with me tomorrow at noon. So this is an amazing festival of cool people, 2/3 of whom are historians. So that's going really well for the cause. So I always, I mean, in-person things, I've moved along. I'm okay with the changes in lots of ways, but I still get to whoop at this occasion. So on behalf of all the people who were muted and so on, I get to clap, and because that was a spectacular visit. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure. Really appreciate this, Patty. Thanks. And thanks to all of you all being part of this. We appreciate it.